A manager of a luxury café threw a freezing, desperate woman back into a lethal blizzard because she couldn't afford a $9 coffee. He cited corporate policy, threatened to call the police, and physically locked the glass doors, leaving her to die in the snow. He thought he was strictly enforcing brand standards. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he just evicted was the billionaire CEO and sole owner of the entire restaurant group. Before we see what he does next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a human being could look a freezing woman in the eye and push her into a deadly storm, you must understand the architecture of the Roasters Guild. It was not a cozy neighborhood coffee shop. It was the flagship location of Collins Hospitality, a massive corporate empire built on the ruthless execution of flawless aesthetics. Inside the cafe, the temperature was a constant 72 degrees. The espresso was extracted at exactly 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 26 seconds. The music was ambient jazz regulated to 45 decibels. A single cup of black coffee cost $9. The customers didn't pay for the caffeine. They paid for the absolute certainty that the environment would remain pristine, sterile, and entirely undisturbed by the ugly, chaotic reality of the outside world. The enforcer of this sterile environment was the shift manager, Dennis Clark. Dennis was 34 years old. He was a product of modern corporate conditioning. He didn't yell, he didn't throw tantrums, and he didn't act out of malice. He simply operated like a machine. To Dennis, the cafe was a tightly calibrated spreadsheet, and the human beings working inside it were operational variables that required strict regulation. He governed by the thick black corporate rulebook. Empathy was not a metric he was hired to track. Standing behind the massive chrome espresso machine was Greg Turner. Greg was 24, a senior barista, and the exact operational opposite of Dennis. Greg didn't survive on corporate metrics. He survived on raw, exhausting endurance. He was a full-time university student, drowning in student loans. He worked the grueling closing shifts just to keep the heat on in his cramped, windowless apartment. His entire life was a delicate, terrifying mathematical equation. He made exactly $14 an hour. His rent was $900. His textbooks were $300. Every single cent was calculated. His shoes were taped together at the soles, and his lower back ached continuously. One missed shift, one unexpected expense, meant financial ruin. He worked perfectly because he was utterly terrified of poverty. At 8:15 p.m., the winter storm outside the heavy glass windows escalated into a severe blizzard. The temperature plummeted to minus 12 degrees. The streets were completely empty, paralyzed by the ice. The city's emergency grid was failing. Inside, the cafe was silent, occupied by only two wealthy patrons working on their laptops. Greg was systematically wiping down the stainless steel prep station. He moved with a practiced mechanical rhythm, desperate to finish the closing procedures on time. As he moved a heavy ceramic mug to the drying rack, a single minuscule drop of whole milk splashed onto the polished oak counter. Greg instantly grabbed a clean microfiber cloth to wipe it away. Before the cloth could touch the wood, a pale hand slammed down onto the counter. Dennis materialized from the back office. He stared at the single drop of milk and then looked at the digital stopwatch strapped to his left wrist. "Greg," Dennis said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of any human inflection. "What does Section 3, Paragraph B of the Collins Hospitality Sanitation Manual state regarding dairy spills on customer-facing surfaces?" Greg froze. He took a slow, deep breath, suppressing a wave of deep physical exhaustion. "It states that all dairy spills must be sanitized with chemical spray immediately, Dennis. Not just wiped with a dry cloth." "Correct," Dennis replied, tapping his tablet with a plastic stylus. "You reach for a dry cloth. That is a cross-contamination hazard. Furthermore, the counter was unattended for 4.2 seconds while the dairy sat on the wood. We do not charge $9 a cup to serve our guests in a barn. This is a premium establishment." "It was one drop, Dennis," Greg said quietly, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "There are no customers at the counter." "The standard does not change based on foot traffic," Dennis stated, his eyes locked on the glowing screen of his tablet. "Consistency is our only product. I am writing you up for a sanitation violation. According to protocol, this results in an automatic 15-minute deduction from your shift pay." Greg stared at the manager in disbelief. 15 minutes of pay was $3.50. To Dennis, it was just a statistical correction. To Greg, it was his subway fare for the next 2 days. It was a tangible, vital piece of his survival, erased without a second of hesitation. Greg didn't argue. Arguing with Dennis was like arguing with a brick wall. He simply nodded, grabbed the chemical spray, and scrubbed the wood until it gleamed. He swallowed his anger, completely unaware that the ruthless corporate logic Dennis was enforcing over a drop of milk was about to be tested against a matter of life and death. Because outside in the freezing dark, the city's infrastructure was collapsing. Cars were abandoned on the interstate. The wind chill had reached a lethal -20, and stumbling blindly through the snow, fighting against severe hypothermia, was a lone woman. Her coat was soaked through, her hands were numb, and her core temperature was dropping to fatal levels. She was walking straight toward the glowing, sterile warmth of the glass doors. Greg Turner did not have the luxury of pride. Pride was an emotion reserved for people who had savings accounts, safety nets, and parents who could pay their rent. Greg had none of those things. His entire existence was a high-wire act of mathematics, balanced precariously on the $14 an hour he earned at the Roasters Guild. He was a senior barista, but the title offered no immunity from the crushing reality of his finances. His monthly take-home pay, after federal and state taxes, was approximately $1,700. His rent for a tiny, water-damaged studio apartment in the deep suburbs was $950. His university tuition, which he paid in agonizing monthly installments, devoured another $400. Electricity, water, and basic internet cost $120. That left him with $230 a month for food, transportation, and absolute survival, $7.60 a day. Every movement Greg made behind the espresso machine was dictated by this brutal arithmetic. His hands were raw and cracking from the heavy-duty sanitizing chemicals, but he never complained. He never spoke back to Dennis. He never questioned the senseless draconian rules. He executed the 50-step drink recipes with a robotic precision. If he lost his job, he wouldn't just lose his income. He would lose his apartment within 30 days. He would drop out of school. The delicate architecture of his survival would collapse entirely. He swallowed the anger of the $3 penalty and continued cleaning the stainless steel racks. The environment inside the cafe was completely disconnected from the reality of the human beings who worked there. Collins Hospitality had designed the store to be an impenetrable fortress of luxury. The walls were clad in imported Italian walnut. The countertops were pure white quartz. The ambient jazz played on a loop, carefully selected by corporate psychologists to induce a feeling of relaxed affluence in the customers. It was a space engineered to make the wealthy forget about the outside world. And tonight, the outside world was turning deadly. At 8:30 p.m., the winter storm escalated from a severe weather event into a full-scale meteorological disaster. The local news had been issuing emergency broadcast alerts since noon. The wind chill outside the thick double-pane glass had dropped to a lethal -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The city plows had officially been pulled from the streets due to zero visibility. The interstate, located just a quarter-mile away, was completely paralyzed, transformed into a frozen graveyard of abandoned vehicles. Dennis Clark walked out of the back office carrying a black clipboard. He was completely unfazed by the howling wind battering the glass doors. To Dennis, a blizzard was not a human crisis. It was simply a potential variable in his operational metrics. He began the mandatory 8:30 p.m. closing audit. The checklist contained 98 specific items that had to be verified before the doors were locked at exactly 9 p.m. Dennis walked to the retail display shelves, adjusting a bag of imported coffee beans by a fraction of an inch to ensure it was perfectly parallel to the edge. The thermostat must remain at 72 degrees until all customers have exited the premises, Dennis announced to the empty room, checking a box on his clipboard. Greg, verify the pastry case temperature. It must read below 40 degrees, or the remaining inventory is logged as a biohazard and destroyed. Verified, Greg replied mechanically, not looking up from his cleaning rag. 38 degrees. Noted, Dennis said, his voice flat. He walked over to the front windows and looked out at the swirling white abyss. Foot traffic has dropped to 0. Revenue per square foot for the last hour is statistically unacceptable. However, we do not close early. Collins Hospitality Standard Operating Procedure dictates that our hours of operation are an absolute contract with the public. We stay open until 9 p.m., not a minute sooner. Dennis turned away from the window and returned to his clipboard, entirely missing the dark silhouette that had just stumbled into the pooling light of the street lamp outside. It was a woman. She was not a vagrant, and she was not dressed for a blizzard. She wore a tailored gray wool coat, expensive but completely useless against the sub-zero wind chill. Her car had died on the interstate an hour ago, the battery failing instantly in the extreme cold. With her cell phone dead and the emergency services completely overwhelmed, she had been forced to walk. For 2 miles, she had fought through knee-deep snow. The snow had frozen her eyelashes together. The heavy wool coat was soaked through, acting like a block of solid ice against her skin. She could no longer feel her hands or her feet. The violent shivering that had racked her body for the first mile had terrifyingly stopped, a severe late-stage symptom of clinical hypothermia. Her core temperature was dropping toward the point of fatal organ failure. The survival instinct was the only thing firing in her freezing brain. Through the blinding snow, she saw the warm, golden light spilling from the massive glass windows of the Roasters Guild. It was the only building on the block with its lights still on. It was a beacon of survival. She dragged her frozen, unfeeling legs toward the heavy glass doors, desperate for just 10 minutes of warmth to keep her heart beating. Inside, Dennis tapped his plastic stylus against the clipboard, perfectly content in his sterile, heavily regulated world. He was completely unprepared for the reality that was about to shatter his flawless metrics. The heavy glass doors of the Roasters Guild were rated to withstand hurricane-force winds. But at 8:36 p.m., they were violently shoved open by a force much more desperate than the weather. A freezing blast of sub-zero wind immediately ripped through the sterile, 72-degree air of the cafe. A flurry of white snow scattered across the pristine quartz countertops. Greg looked up from the espresso machine. Dennis instantly stopped tapping his tablet, his eyes snapping toward the entrance. His perfectly calibrated environment had just been breached. Linda Collins stumbled into the light. She did not look like a stereotypical vagrant, nor did she act like an entitled customer. She looked like a casualty of war. Her tailored gray wool coat was saturated with freezing water, clinging to her skin like a heavy layer of ice. Her leather boots were ruined, leaving thick black footprints of toxic urban slush on the immaculate Italian walnut floor. She had no purse, no phone, and no umbrella. She had abandoned everything in her dead vehicle on the interstate just to survive the 2-mile walk. The medical reality of her condition was terrifying. Linda was in the dangerous transitional phase of severe hypothermia. Her body was desperately trying to keep her vital organs functioning. Her skin was a horrifying ashen gray. Her lips were completely bloodless. She was shivering so violently that her teeth audibly clicked together, a rapid, uncontrollable physical spasm that made it impossible for her to speak. She didn't walk to the counter to order. She didn't ask for help. Her freezing brain was operating on a single, primal imperative: find a heat source. Linda dragged her numb legs past the front display cases, ignoring the two wealthy patrons who stared at her in quiet alarm. She moved with a slow, agonizing limp toward the far back corner of the cafe. There, tucked behind a row of leather armchairs, was a massive industrial floor heater. She collapsed into the chair closest to the vent. She didn't take off her soaked coat. She lacked the fine motor skills in her hands to even grasp the buttons. She simply pulled her knees to her chest, curling into a tight, trembling ball, desperately trying to absorb the artificial heat blowing from the iron grate. She closed her eyes, her chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. Behind the counter, the silence was deafening. The ambient jazz continued to play, a surreal and mocking soundtrack to a life and death struggle. Greg wiped his hands on his apron. His instincts kicked in immediately. Growing up in a neighborhood where the heating failed every winter, he recognized the terrifying physical signs of deep cold. He knew that the woman in the corner wasn't just uncomfortable, her body was actively shutting down. He reached beneath the counter, grabbing a clean ceramic mug to pour her a cup of hot water. It was the absolute baseline of human decency. But before Greg could touch the hot water dispenser, Dennis stepped directly into his path. Dennis wasn't looking at Linda with empathy. He was looking at the trail of dirty, melting snow she had tracked across his flawless floor. He was looking at a human being who had not purchased a $9 beverage, occupying a premium leather armchair. "Put the mug down, Greg," Dennis said. His voice was not angry. It was chillingly calm, the voice of a man reciting a legal document. "Dennis, look at her," Greg whispered, leaning in close so the other customers wouldn't hear. "She's in severe hypothermia. She can't even stand up straight. I'm just going to give her hot water to raise her core temperature." "You will do no such thing," Dennis replied, his eyes locked on the puddle of slush expanding around Linda's boots. "Look at the floor. She is tracking biohazards onto untreated wood. She has no bags. She has no wallet. She is not a patron. She's a human being freezing to death," Greg hissed, his frustration finally cracking his quiet operational demeanor. Dennis slowly turned his head to look at Greg. The absolute absence of emotion in the manager's eyes was more terrifying than the blizzard outside. "This is a premium commercial establishment, Greg," Dennis said smoothly. "It is not a municipal warming center. Section 4 of the operational manual is completely unambiguous. No loitering, no consumption of outside food, no occupying seating without a valid receipt. She is a liability, and she is destroying the brand aesthetic." Dennis adjusted the cuffs of his pristine shirt and picked up his tablet. "I am going to ask her to leave. If she refuses, I will have her removed." Dennis Clark did not march across the cafe with the dramatic anger of a villain. He walked with the measured, even pace of an auditor, inspecting a flawed ledger. His rubber-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the Italian walnut floor as he approached the back corner of the room. From behind the espresso machine, Greg watched in tense silence. He gripped the edge of the quartz counter, his knuckles turning white. The logic of his own survival screamed at him to stay out of it. If he intervened, Dennis would fire him for insubordination, and Greg would be evicted by the end of the month. The math was simple and brutal. But as he looked at the shivering woman curled by the heater, the math felt like a crime. Dennis stopped exactly 3 feet away from Linda. He did not ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a blanket. Instead, his eyes performed a rapid clinical inventory of the damage she was causing to the brand's aesthetic. He noted the pool of dirty, melting slush soaking into the expensive rug beneath her boots. He noted the dampness transferring from her ruined wool coat onto the premium leather of the armchair. Most importantly, he noted the absolute absence of a branded Collins Hospitality coffee cup in her hands. She was a non-paying entity occupying a revenue-generating space. "Excuse me, ma'am," Dennis said. His voice was polite, perfectly modulated, and entirely hollow. Linda slowly lifted her head. Her vision was slightly blurred, the edges of the room darkening as her body redirected blood flow away from her extremities to protect her failing heart. She looked at the man in the pristine uniform. She tried to form a sentence, but her jaw was locked in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. My car?" Linda finally managed to stutter, the words barely audible over the hum of the cafe's HVAC system. "D died. Interstate. Just 10 minutes. Please." She wasn't begging for money. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for a fraction of the artificial heat radiating from the industrial vent, just enough to stabilize her core temperature before she tried to walk the remaining blocks to a hospital. "I understand that the weather is suboptimal tonight," Dennis replied smoothly, completely ignoring the terrifying physical reality of her distress. "However, this is a private commercial establishment. We are not a municipal warming shelter." "Dennis!" Greg called out from the counter, his voice cracking the mandated silence of the cafe. "Just look the other way. Let her sit there for 15 minutes until she stops shaking. The store is completely dead anyway. She's not hurting anyone." Dennis didn't even turn his head to look at the barista. "Greg, your emotional reaction is clouding your operational judgment. Section 4 of the Employee Handbook is not a suggestion. It states that seating is strictly reserved for paying patrons. Allowing unauthorized individuals to loiter creates a precedent that degrades the premium experience for actual customers." Dennis pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the puddle of snow melting on the floor. "She is creating a slip and fall hazard. She is damaging the upholstery. She is actively costing the company money by simply sitting there." "She is freezing to death," Greg said, taking a step out from behind the counter, risking his job and his apartment. "She is trespassing," Dennis corrected coldly. He turned his attention back to Linda. She was pulling her wet coat tighter around her shivering body, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep physiological panic. The two wealthy patrons at the nearby tables kept their eyes glued to their laptops, actively pretending the confrontation wasn't happening. They had paid $9 specifically so they wouldn't have to deal with the ugly realities of the outside world. "Ma'am," Dennis continued, his tone hardening into an absolute bureaucratic command, "you are violating the comfort of our paying guests. You do not have a receipt. I am formally asking you to vacate this private property immediately." The demand hung in the sterile, 72-degree air of the cafe. Vacate the property. Linda Collins stared up at the shift manager. Her brain, severely sluggish from the dropping core temperature, struggled to process the absurdity of the sentence. She was a woman who commanded corporate boardrooms, negotiated multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions, and employed thousands of people. But in this exact moment, stripped of her identity, her wealth, and her phone, she was just a biological organism failing to survive a winter storm. "Please!" Linda forced the word past her violently chattering teeth. Her voice was weak, slurred by the cold. "I have money. My wallet is in the car. Just let me warm my hands. 10 minutes. I will pay whatever you want." Dennis Clark did not blink. He looked at her not with malice, but with the cold, calculating indifference of an automated system encountering a syntax error. "Verbal promises of future payment do not constitute a valid transaction, ma'am," Dennis replied, his voice maintaining its perfectly modulated customer service pitch. "Collins' hospitality policy strictly prohibits the issuance of credit or the accommodation of non-paying individuals based on external circumstances. The weather outside is not the operational responsibility of this cafe." From behind the espresso machine, Greg Turner felt physically sick. The sheer sociopathic detachment of the manager's logic was suffocating. Dennis wasn't quoting the rulebook to be cruel. He was quoting it because he genuinely believed that the rules of the corporation superseded the basic laws of human survival. "Dennis, you are going to kill her," Greg said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. He stepped out from behind the counter, the thin canvas soles of his work shoes squeaking on the immaculate floor. "If you push her back out into a -20 wind chill in wet clothes, her heart is going to stop before she reaches the end of the block. I will buy her a coffee. Ring up a black drip coffee and take it out of my till." Dennis slowly turned his head to look at the barista. "You are currently off your assigned station, Greg. Return to the espresso bar immediately, or I will log this as job abandonment." "I am paying for her drink," Greg shot back, reaching into his apron to grab his own wallet. "You cannot purchase a beverage for a vagrant to legitimize their presence after they have already violated the sanitation and loitering protocols," Dennis stated smoothly, shutting down the loophole with bureaucratic precision. "She has tracked biohazards onto the floor. She is dripping water onto premium leather. The transaction is refused." Dennis turned his attention back to Linda, who was now clutching her knees, her eyes wide with a terrifying, helpless panic. Dennis reached into the pocket of his pristine, pressed trousers and pulled out his smartphone. He didn't dial 911 for a medical emergency. He unlocked the screen and opened his contacts, scrolling to the non-emergency dispatch number for the local police precinct. "I am not going to ask you again, ma'am," Dennis said, his thumb hovering over the call button. "If you do not stand up and exit the building immediately, I am going to contact law enforcement and have you formally trespassed from this property. When the police arrive, you will be forcibly removed, and you will face criminal charges for disrupting a commercial business." Linda looked at the phone. Even through the heavy fog of hypothermia, her sharp, analytical mind recognized the fatal reality of the situation. If the police were called, they wouldn't treat her like a CEO in distress. They would treat her like a belligerent trespasser. She would be dragged outside, humiliated, and likely thrown into a freezing holding cell before anyone bothered to check her identity. The scandal, the physical danger, the sheer indignity of it, it was unacceptable. She had built her entire empire by relying solely on herself. She would not allow a middle manager with a stopwatch to hand her over to the police. With a massive, agonizing effort, Linda placed her numb, trembling hands on the armrests of the chair. Her joints screamed in protest. Her wet wool coat felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She pushed herself up. Her legs wobbled violently, her knees threatening to buckle under her own weight. She couldn't even feel her feet hitting the Italian walnut floor. "I'm leaving," Linda slurred, her chest heaving as she fought for balance. She didn't look at Dennis. She didn't have the energy to spare for anger. Every single calorie she had left was dedicated to staying upright. Dennis stepped back, giving her a wide berth, ensuring her wet coat didn't brush against his immaculate uniform. He watched her struggle toward the front of the store with the detached satisfaction of a man who had successfully resolved an operational discrepancy. Greg stood frozen in the middle of the floor, watching the freezing woman drag herself back toward the heavy glass doors and the howling white abyss beyond them. The math of his life, the rent, the tuition, the crushing debt, screamed at him to look away and go back to wiping the counters. But as Linda's trembling hand reached for the cold metal handle of the door, the math in Greg's head violently collapsed. Linda's trembling fingers barely curled around the frozen metal handle of the heavy glass door. The wind howled against the exterior pane, rattling the frame, a deadly, freezing void waiting to swallow her. Before she could pull the door open, a dark hand pressed flat against the glass just above her head, holding it firmly shut. Linda slowly turned her head. Greg stood between her and the storm. The mathematical equation that governed Greg Turner's life, the carefully balanced spreadsheet of rent, tuition, and basic survival, had completely shattered. He looked at the ashen, shivering woman, and the cold reality of the situation eclipsed his financial terror. He realized that if he let her walk out that door, he would be paying for his apartment with a human life. It was a price his conscience simply could not afford. "Greg," Dennis said from the center of the room. The manager's voice was sharp, cutting through the ambient jazz. "Remove your hand from the door. You are obstructing a non-patron from exiting the premises. This is a direct violation of protocol." Greg didn't look at Dennis. He looked down at Linda. Her breathing was terrifyingly shallow. Her eyes were glazed over, the severe hypothermia dulling her awareness of the conflict happening around her. "You're not going back out there without a coat," Greg said softly to her. He turned his back to the door and finally faced the shift manager. "Dennis, if you force her out into a -20 wind chill, she will die," Greg said, his voice completely steady. The fear of losing his job was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. "And when they find her body tomorrow morning, I will personally make sure the police and the press know exactly who locked the door." Dennis narrowed his eyes. It was the first time his perfectly calibrated operational demeanor cracked, revealing a flicker of genuine irritation. It wasn't remorse. It was simply annoyance at a malfunctioning variable on his floor. "Are you threatening the brand's reputation, Greg?" Dennis asked coldly. "I'm stating a biological fact," Greg replied. "She is in late-stage hypothermia. You are issuing a death sentence over a puddle of melted snow." Dennis tapped his stylus against the clipboard. He didn't engage with the moral argument. He engaged strictly with the corporate hierarchy. "You are off your station. You are attempting to harbor a trespasser. You are threatening a superior. I am issuing a code red insubordination protocol." Dennis walked behind the espresso counter, picked up the store's primary operational tablet, and rapidly typed his managerial override code. "Greg Turner," Dennis announced, looking at the glowing screen. "Your employment with Collins Hospitality is terminated, effective immediately. I am flagging your profile in the central HR database. You are permanently blacklisted from all corporate subsidiaries. You will not receive a reference, and your final paycheck will be mailed after uniform and sanitation deductions." The words were a financial execution. In exactly 30 seconds, Dennis had stripped Greg of his livelihood, his ability to pay rent, and his safety net. Greg didn't flinch. He didn't argue, and he certainly didn't beg. He simply reached behind his neck and untied the knot of his heavy canvas apron. He pulled it over his head, folded it with the exact precision he had been trained to use, and placed it neatly on the nearest table. "Understood," Greg said calmly. He walked behind the counter one last time. Dennis tensed, preparing to call security, but Greg completely ignored the cash register. Instead, he reached into his personal employee locker beneath the espresso machine. He pulled out a crumpled envelope containing his cash tips from the last 3 shifts. Exactly $38. He shoved the money into his jeans. Then, Greg reached onto the backroom coat rack and pulled down his own winter jacket. It wasn't a tailored, expensive wool coat. It was a heavy, insulated, waterproof puffer jacket he had bought at a discount store, specifically designed to withstand the brutal city winters. He walked back to the freezing woman by the door, passing Dennis without a second glance. Greg held the thick, warm jacket open. "Put your arms through, ma'am," Greg instructed quietly, helping Linda guide her numb hands into the sleeves. "We are leaving." Greg pushed the heavy glass door open. The pressure differential between the pressurized 72-degree café and the violent sub-zero blizzard outside created a localized vacuum, nearly ripping the metal handle from his grip. He guided Linda out onto the frozen concrete sidewalk. Behind them, the heavy door swung shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, metallic clack that echoed over the howling wind. Through the thick, double-pane glass, Greg could see Dennis Clark. The manager didn't look angry, vindictive, or remorseful. He simply looked efficient. Dennis held a brass key in one hand and his corporate tablet in the other. He had already marked the trespassing incident as resolved and Greg's employment status as terminated for cause. Without a second glance at the 2 human beings fighting for their lives on the pavement, Dennis turned his back and walked toward the office to complete his closing audit. The pristine environment of the Roasters Guild was secure, Outside, the reality of Greg's decision hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had given Linda his insulated, waterproof puffer jacket. It was the only piece of winter survival gear he owned. He was left standing in the storm, wearing his corporate uniform, a thin, black cotton long-sleeve shirt and standard-issue slacks. The -20-degree wind chill didn't just feel cold, it felt like millions of tiny freezing needles piercing his skin simultaneously. Within 10 seconds, Greg lost all feeling in his fingers. The moisture in his eyes began to crystallize, blurring his vision. He looked at Linda. The oversized puffer jacket swallowed her frail frame, offering an immediate, vital barrier against the wind. But it wasn't enough to reverse the deep, systemic hypothermia that had already taken hold in her blood. She was leaning heavily against the brick exterior of the café, her breathing shallow and erratic. She couldn't feel her legs. Her eyes were rolling back. "We can't stop!" Greg yelled over the deafening roar of the wind, grabbing her arm. "Ma'am, you have to keep moving. If we stay here, we're both going to freeze to death." Linda tried to nod, but the muscles in her neck were completely stiff. "Where?" she managed to whisper, the single word instantly snatched away by the gale. Greg's mind raced, executing the grim, desperate mathematics of urban survival. The streets were completely abandoned. There were no cabs, no police cruisers, no passing cars. The blizzard had shut down the entire municipal grid. The nearest hospital was 3 miles away, an impossible, lethal distance on foot. His own apartment was a 40-minute bus ride into the deep suburbs, and the transit system was paralyzed. He needed an immediate heat source. He needed a bunker. "The transit hub," Greg said, his jaw tightening as the cold began to lock his facial muscles. "The underground subway terminal on 4th Street. It's 4 blocks away. It's subterranean, so it stays above freezing, and the wind can't reach us. We just have to make it 4 blocks." For a healthy person on a clear spring afternoon, 4 city blocks was a 5-minute stroll. For a severe hypothermia victim and a man in a thin cotton shirt navigating knee-deep snowdrifts in a blizzard, it was an agonizing marathon. Greg wrapped his arm tightly around Linda's waist, acting as a human crutch. He positioned himself on her left side, taking the absolute brunt of the freezing wind, shielding her as best as he could. They began to walk. Every step was a brutal physical battle. The snow was packed tight, slick with hidden sheets of black ice. Greg's thin canvas work shoes were instantly soaked through, the freezing slush turning his feet into blocks of lead. He couldn't feel the ground. He had to rely purely on momentum to keep them moving forward, dragging Linda through the drifts. 1 block. Linda stumbled, her ruined leather boots slipping violently on the ice. She went down hard, dragging Greg with her into a massive pile of frozen snow. "Get up!" Greg shouted, his voice cracking from the sub-zero air tearing at his vocal cords. He hauled her back to her feet, his own muscles screaming an agonizing protest. "Do not close your eyes! You have to keep moving!" 2 blocks. Greg's vision began to tunnel. The violent shivering that had taken over his body was starting to subside. It was the exact same terrifying biological red flag he had recognized in Linda back at the cafe. His core temperature was dropping dangerously fast. The thin cotton shirt offered zero insulation. The cold was sinking deep into his chest, compressing his lungs, making every breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. He thought about the $14 an hour. He thought about his $900 rent. He had thrown it all away. He was going to be evicted. He was going to fail out of university. He had completely destroyed his own life, and now he was probably going to die on a frozen sidewalk for a woman he didn't even know. But as he looked at Linda, fighting with every ounce of her failing strength just to take another step, he felt a strange, absolute clarity. He had made the right choice. Even if it cost him everything, he had refused to be a machine. "Almost there," Greg gasped, his lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. Just 2 more blocks. 3 blocks. The physical mechanics of extreme cold are entirely predictable. As the core body temperature drops below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the brain systematically shuts down non-essential capillary functions to conserve energy for the vital organs. Motor skills rapidly deteriorate. Spatial awareness vanishes. Pain receptors become numb. For Greg Turner, the sudden numbness was a critical warning. The agonizing burning sensation in his hands and feet completely disappeared, replaced by a lethargic warmth. This was a lethal neurological hallucination. He was wearing a thin black cotton uniform shirt in a -20-degree wind chill. His biological systems were actively failing. He dragged Linda Collins through the knee-deep snow of the third block. She was no longer assisting in her own forward momentum. The oversized puffer jacket had stopped the wind from pulling more heat from her body, but she was dead weight, leaning entirely against his shoulder. Her breathing was a shallow, barely audible rasp. "Open your eyes," Greg commanded. His voice was a flat, mechanical rasp, stripped of all emotion by physical exhaustion. "Do not go to sleep." Linda did not respond. 4 blocks. The concrete stairs of the 4th Street subterranean transit hub appeared through the whiteout. It was a brutalist structure of gray stone and heavy steel. Greg gripped the icy handrail and guided her down the steps. The moment they crossed the subterranean threshold, the violent howl of the blizzard was severed. It was replaced by the low, mechanical hum of the station's ventilation fans. Greg pushed through the heavy municipal doors. A blast of 80-degree artificial heat hit them. The terminal was a cavernous space of cracked white tile and rows of molded plastic benches. It was completely deserted. The city had suspended the trains hours ago, but the municipal heating grid remained fully operational. Greg dragged Linda to the nearest plastic bench. She slumped sideways against the tiled wall, her eyes half closed, her body limp. Greg collapsed onto the bench next to her. The terrifying numbness in his extremities began to recede, replaced by a violent, burning agony as blood rushed back into frozen capillaries. He doubled over, burying his face in his hands, shaking uncontrollably. He executed a silent, procedural inventory of his situation. He was 24 years old. He had $38. He was unemployed. He was facing eviction. The operational mathematics of his life had flatlined. Greg forced himself to sit up and evaluated Linda. The heavy puffer jacket was functioning as intended. The artificial heat of the terminal was penetrating the soaked layers of her coat. The ashen gray color of her skin was fading to a painful red. Her violently chattering teeth had slowed to a manageable shiver. She was stabilizing. Greg reached into the front pocket of his wet uniform pants. His fingers lacked fine motor control. He clumsily extracted the crumpled envelope containing his cash tips. He pulled out the $38, 3 $10 bills, a 5, and 3 ones. He placed the money directly into Linda's lap. "The trains are suspended," Greg said. "But the transit authority runs emergency shuttle buses from the upper concourse once the plows clear the primary avenues. That is $38. It is enough to pay for a shuttle or a cab. Do not leave this underground level until you have a confirmed ride." Linda slowly opened her eyes. The severe brain fog of the hypothermia was lifting. Her sharp, analytical mind recognized the data. She looked down at the crumpled bills, then at the young man. She noted his soaked cotton shirt. She noted his violent shivering and the blue tint of his lips. He had stripped himself of protection, walked into a fatal storm, and was handing her the only cash he possessed. She processed the raw data with cold, absolute precision. "You forfeited your employment," Linda stated. Her voice was weak, but the cadence was entirely steady and procedural. "My employment status is irrelevant," Greg replied, staring blankly at the tiled wall. "You were going to die on the floor." "The shift manager," Linda continued, "he cited Section 4 of the operational manual. He logged a code-red insubordination protocol against you. He stated he was flagging your profile in the central HR database. Is that correct? Greg turned to look at her, confused by the extreme specificity of the questions. She sounded like an auditor conducting an after-action review. Yes, Greg said simply. What is your name? Linda asked. Greg Turner. What is your employee identification number, Greg? Greg frowned. 4279. Why? And the manager who initiated the termination, Linda asked. Dennis Clark. Linda nodded slowly. Dennis Clark, 4279. Understood. She closed her eyes again to absorb the ambient heat. Greg watched her for a moment before his own physical exhaustion overtook him. He leaned back against the hard plastic bench. Greg assumed he was sitting next to a woman whose mind had been temporarily fractured by the cold. He had absolutely no idea that she was silently, methodically dismantling the career of the manager who locked them out, and restructuring the corporate hierarchy of Collins Hospitality in her head. Greg sat on the hard plastic bench until the violent shivering finally subsided into a dull, exhausted ache. He had to keep moving. If he fell asleep in his wet clothes, even in the 80-degree terminal, pneumonia was a statistical certainty. He stood up. His legs felt like lead. The emergency shuttles will start running by 5 a.m., Greg told Linda, his voice devoid of emotion. There's a heated waiting area on the upper concourse. Go there. Do not go outside until your cab is right at the curb. Linda looked up at him. Where are you going? Home, Greg said simply. It is a blizzard, she stated, her analytical mind fully restored. You do not have a coat. You gave me your money. How are you traveling? I'll walk fast, Greg replied flatly. It was a lie. He had a 3-mile trek to his suburban apartment. She reached into her lap, holding out the crumpled bills. Take your money back. I can manage. Greg shook his head. I don't need it tonight. You do. He didn't wait for a response. Greg turned and walked away, pushing through the heavy municipal doors and stepping back into the freezing void of the storm. The journey to his apartment was not heroic. It was a blur of absolute physical agony. He operated on pure mechanical stubbornness. The freezing wind tore through his thin cotton uniform, turning his wet clothes into a rigid shell of ice. He couldn't feel his face or his hands. The thought of his lost job, his unpaid tuition, and his impending eviction completely vanished. The human brain cannot process financial ruin when it is actively trying to prevent the heart from stopping. He reached his apartment building at 3:15 a.m. It was a cramped, water-damaged studio in a decaying brick complex. Greg unlocked the door with completely numb fingers, stripped off his frozen uniform, and stood under the shower until the small water heater ran completely cold. He collapsed into his bed under 3 thin blankets. As his body finally began to warm, the brutal mathematics of his life returned. He was unemployed. He had $0 in his pocket. His rent was due in 2 weeks. He stared at the cracked ceiling in the dark, accepting his fate. He had committed financial suicide to save a stranger. By dawn, the storm had finally broken. The morning sun rose over a paralyzed city. The streets were buried under 2 feet of snow, and the municipal plows were working overtime to clear the primary avenues. But at the Roasters Guild, operations were flawless. Dennis Clark unlocked the heavy glass doors at exactly 6:30 a.m. He noted the massive snowdrifts, but the sidewalk immediately in front of the café had been cleared by the building's private contractors. Dennis walked to the back office, poured himself a perfectly extracted cup of espresso, and logged into the corporate terminal. He opened the HR portal and finalized Greg Turner's termination paperwork. He selected gross insubordination and job abandonment from the drop-down menus. He clicked Submit, permanently blacklisting the young barista from the company, and immediately submitted a requisition form for a replacement. Dennis felt a profound sense of administrative satisfaction. The system had been challenged the previous night by an anomaly, the freezing woman and a malfunctioning asset, Greg. Dennis had neutralized both threats, protected the property, and maintained the brand standard without a single deviation from protocol. He adjusted his pristine uniform, entirely confident in his managerial excellence. He had absolutely no idea that the anomaly he had evicted was currently sitting in a high-security corporate penthouse, drinking hot tea and authorizing a ruthless, full-scale legal audit of his café. At 8 a.m., the city was still paralyzed by the aftermath of the blizzard, but the corporate headquarters of Collins Hospitality operated on a massive, independent generator grid. In the penthouse suite overlooking the frozen skyline, Linda Collins stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was no longer the freezing, helpless woman shivering in a subterranean transit hub. She wore a tailored, immaculate charcoal blazer, her posture rigid, her core temperature completely stabilized by the finest private medical care available. Linda had not inherited her empire. She had built Collins Hospitality from a single, failing diner in a deeply impoverished neighborhood, systematically turning it into a massive corporate entity with 300 premium locations across the country. Because she had started at the absolute bottom, scrubbing floors and balancing registers herself, she maintained a ruthless, obsessive focus on the ground-level operations of her business. She despised executives who managed entirely from spreadsheets. To maintain operational reality, she frequently conducted unannounced, blind audits of her own properties, deliberately presenting herself as an ordinary, sometimes difficult customer to test the actual human infrastructure of her brand. Last night was not supposed to be an audit. It was a genuine, terrifying emergency caused by a dead car battery and a paralyzed power grid, but it had yielded the most catastrophic audit results of her entire career. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse office clicked open. Allison Cooper walked in. Allison was the head of corporate legal and internal audit. She was a woman who spoke exclusively in liabilities, risk assessments, and contractual obligations. She carried a locked digital tablet and a thick physical file folder. "Good morning, Ms. Collins," Allison said, her voice completely neutral. "Medical cleared you an hour ago. You are entirely stabilized. Security protocols dictate that your driver is currently being formally reprimanded for losing GPS contact with your vehicle during the whiteout. Leave the driver alone. The municipal grid failed. It was an act of God," Linda replied, turning away from the frozen window. She walked to her massive oak desk and sat down. "We have a much more severe operational failure to address. I want you to pull the employee roster for the Roasters Guild flagship location on 4th and Elm. Specifically, I need the data on the shift manager who closed the store last night, and the senior barista who was on duty." Allison opened her tablet, her fingers moving rapidly across the encrypted screen, accessing the localized database. The shift manager on record is Dennis Clark. The senior barista was Greg Turner. I am seeing an immediate update on the roster submitted at 6:45 a.m. today. Greg Turner's employment status has been changed to terminated. The codes logged are gross insubordination, job abandonment, and violation of sanitation protocol. Linda's expression did not change, but her eyes hardened into polished obsidian. "Dennis Clark executed that termination?" "Confirmed," Allison said, reading the digital ledger. "The termination was authorized using managerial override code 884. Dennis Clark is currently on shift at the location. He opened the store at 6:30 a.m. He has also submitted a priority requisition form to HR for a replacement barista to cover the evening shifts." "Cancel the requisition," Linda ordered smoothly, "and freeze Dennis Clark's administrative access to the central corporate database, but do not alert his terminal. Leave his local point-of-sale login active for now, so he does not suspect a system lockout." Allison tapped the screen twice. "Access frozen. What is the nature of the internal review, Ms. Collins?" "It is not a review, Allison. It is a liquidation," Linda stated, her voice as cold as the blizzard outside. "Last night, my vehicle died on the interstate. I walked 2 miles to the café, experiencing late-stage hypothermia. I asked for 10 minutes near a heater. Dennis Clark cited Section 4 of the operational manual, threatened me with police intervention for trespassing, and ordered me back into a fatal wind chill. He did not see a human emergency. He saw a brand liability." Allison stopped typing. For a fraction of a second, the lawyer's strictly professional, emotionless demeanor cracked, revealing a flash of absolute corporate horror. "He attempted to evict you into a minus 20-degree storm? That is not just a public relations catastrophe, Ms. Collins. That is reckless endangerment. If you had succumbed to the elements on our sidewalk, the wrongful death litigation would have targeted the corporate umbrella directly." "Exactly," Linda said. "He strictly followed the rule book, and in doing so, he weaponized our own policies into a fatal liability. A machine cannot run a hospitality business." "And the barista, Greg Turner, terminated for attempting to intervene," Allison deduced instantly, her legal mind connecting the data points. "He intervened," Linda corrected. "He stripped off his own winter coat, gave it to me, defied a direct managerial order, and escorted me to the subterranean transit hub. He gave me the last $38 from his own pocket for a cab. He sacrificed his livelihood and risked his own life to prevent this company from committing manslaughter." Linda stood up, adjusting the cuffs of her charcoal blazer. "Prepare the legal termination packets. Assemble a physical security detail from the lobby. We are going to the Roasters Guild. We are going to conduct a hostile takeover of our own property." At 9:15 a.m., the morning sun reflected blindingly off the massive snowdrifts outside the Roasters Guild. The morning rush was lighter than usual due to the paralyzed roads, but the wealthy patrons who lived within walking distance had returned. The cafe hummed with the sound of acoustic jazz and the hiss of the espresso wands. Dennis Clark stood behind the pastry case, observing the floor. He had called in a junior barista from a neighboring district to cover Greg Turner's sudden absence. The replacement was slightly slower, but Dennis stood directly behind him, managing the workflow with a digital stopwatch. Operations were holding at a 92% efficiency rating. Dennis was satisfied. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to. He had protected the brand, purged a defective employee, and maintained the aesthetic. At 9:22 a.m., 2 matte black corporate SUVs pulled up to the curb directly in front of the cafe's heavy glass doors. They parked illegally in a snow-filled loading zone. Dennis narrowed his eyes. He despised parking violations in front of his store. It ruined the symmetry of the facade. He adjusted his pristine uniform collar, preparing to step outside and inform the drivers that they were blocking a commercial right-of-way. Before he could move, the heavy doors of the vehicles opened simultaneously. 4 individuals stepped onto the cleared sidewalk. 2 were broad-shouldered men wearing dark wool overcoats with transparent earpieces, corporate physical security. The 3rd was a man carrying a heavy leather briefcase. The 4th was Allison Cooper. She wore a tailored navy blue suit and carried a locked digital tablet. They did not look like morning coffee patrons. They moved with the synchronized, rigid efficiency of an executive strike team. Dennis watched them push through the heavy glass doors. The sudden influx of stern, silent individuals in suits instantly shifted the atmosphere of the room. The ambient jazz suddenly seemed too loud. The wealthy patrons typing on their laptops paused, sensing the rapid drop in the room's energy. Dennis immediately recognized the silver corporate badges clipped to their lapels. Collins Hospitality Headquarters. This was a blind audit. Dennis's posture instantly straightened. He was not intimidated by corporate audits. He thrived on them. His floors were immaculate. His refrigeration logs were digitally verified to the exact minute. His uniform was perfectly pressed. He welcomed the inspection. It was an opportunity to showcase his flawless adherence to protocol. Allison Cooper bypassed the line of waiting customers entirely. She walked directly to the main point-of-sale terminal, her high heels clicking sharply against the Italian walnut floor. She did not look at the overhead menu. She did not smile. "Good morning," Dennis said, his voice projecting the perfect modulated tone of a premium service manager. "Welcome to the 4th Street location. I am Dennis Clark, the shift manager. Are we executing a mid-cycle operational audit today?" Allison stopped directly in front of the register. She looked at Dennis with the absolute cold detachment of a medical examiner logging a corpse into a morgue. "Dennis Clark," Allison stated, her voice devoid of any customer service warmth. It was a purely legal cadence. "Employee identification number 8114. You are currently logged into Register 1. "Yes, ma'am," Dennis replied, slightly confused by the aggressive formality. "I am managing the floor during the morning rush. Is there a specific metric you need me to pull from the system?" "No," Allison said. She placed her digital tablet flat on the court's counter. "Step away from the register. Do not touch the cash drawer. Do not touch the espresso machinery." Dennis blinked. "Excuse me? I have patrons waiting for their orders. If I step away, the queue efficiency will drop below acceptable parameters." The man with the heavy leather briefcase stepped up beside Allison. He snapped the brass locks open, extracted a single crisp sheet of watermarked paper, and placed it on the counter directly in front of Dennis. "Dennis," Allison said, her eyes locked entirely onto his. "Queue efficiency is no longer your concern. As of 9:25 a.m., your administrative access to the Collins Hospitality mainframe has been permanently revoked. Your managerial override codes have been disabled. You do not have the authority to process transactions, direct employees, or occupy the staff-designated areas of this property." Dennis stared down at the paper. It was a formal notice of suspension pending liquidation. "I don't understand," Dennis said, his voice finally losing its perfectly modulated pitch, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of genuine panic. "My store metrics are flawless. I successfully protected the property from a trespassing anomaly last night. I terminated an insubordinate employee who attempted to violate health codes. I followed Section 4 of the operational manual to the exact letter." "You did," Allison agreed coldly. "And that is exactly why the owner of the company has arrived to personally oversee your extraction." The heavy glass doors of the cafe opened one final time. Linda Collins stepped inside. She was no longer shivering. She was no longer wearing a ruin-soaked wool coat. She wore an immaculate charcoal blazer, her posture absolute, her presence instantly commanding the entire room. She walked past the line of silent customers, stepping directly up to the court's counter. Dennis Clark looked at her. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain failed to process the visual data. He saw the CEO of the company. Then, as he looked at her face, the horrific realization locked into place. The facial structure, the eyes. It was the exact same woman he had threatened with police intervention just 12 hours ago. The anomaly he had pushed into a -20-degree blizzard. The color completely drained from Dennis's face. His perfectly modulated administrative composure shattered. "You," Dennis whispered, taking a physical step backward until his spine hit the stainless steel espresso machine. "You were the woman by the heater." "I was," Linda stated. She did not yell. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying the exact clinical cadence of an auditor delivering a fatal report. "Last night, my vehicle suffered a catastrophic battery failure on the interstate. I walked 2 miles through a severe weather emergency. I was in the transitional stages of clinical hypothermia. I asked you for 10 minutes of ambient heat to survive." Dennis gripped the edge of the counter. His mind desperately scrambled to find a defense in the corporate rulebook. "Ms. Collins, I didn't know it was you. I had no idea. You didn't identify yourself. I was simply following Section 4 of the manual. The policy strictly prohibits loitering. I was protecting the brand aesthetic." "You were protecting a floor rug," Linda corrected coldly. "You evaluated a human being entering organ failure, and you weighed their life against a puddle of melting snow. And you chose the snow. You did not protect the brand, Dennis. You exposed this corporation to a catastrophic, fatal liability. I followed the rules, Dennis insisted, his voice cracking, desperation bleeding into his tone. I executed the protocol. The barista, Greg, he was violating sanitation standards. He was going to use company resources to harbor a trespasser. I was doing my job. Your job, Linda said, leaning slightly over the counter, her eyes locking onto his, is to manage a hospitality environment using critical reasoning. The operational manual is a framework for efficiency. It is not a legal shield for sociopathy. If a human being dies on the premises of natural causes, it is a tragedy. If a human being freezes to death on the sidewalk because my manager physically locked the glass doors in her face, it is gross negligence. It is a multi-million-dollar wrongful death lawsuit that would have destroyed this entire subsidiary. Dennis opened his mouth to speak, but he had absolutely no counter-argument. The pure, terrifying logic of her statement dismantled his entire worldview. He had followed the rules so blindly that he had nearly killed the person who wrote them. Greg Turner understood risk assessment, Linda continued smoothly. He identified a fatal variable, he calculated the cost, and he neutralized the threat using his own personal resources. He gave me his coat, he gave me his cash, he saved my life, and he saved this company from a devastating scandal. You, on the other hand, functioned as a liability. Linda turned her head slightly to look at the head of the corporate legal. Allison, process the termination. He is terminated for cause, gross negligence and reckless endangerment. He will receive 0 severance. If he attempts to contest the termination with the labor board, you will forward the security footage of him locking the door to the municipal police department. Understood, Allison replied, making a note on her tablet. Hand over your keys, Dennis, Linda ordered, and remove the uniform. You no longer represent Collins Hospitality. Dennis Clark did not argue further. The absolute clinical finality in Linda Collins' voice left no room for negotiation. His entire worldview, built entirely on spreadsheets, metrics, and rigid compliance, had just collapsed under the weight of human reality. With shaking hands, Dennis reached into his pocket and placed the heavy ring of brass store keys onto the quartz counter. He reached up, unclipped the silver manager's badge from his pristine apron, and set it next to the keys. He untied the apron, folded it with the mechanical precision he had practiced 1,000 times, and stepped away from the espresso machine. Escort him off the premises, Allison Cooper instructed the 2 physical security contractors. Dennis walked toward the heavy glass doors. He didn't look at the wealthy patrons sitting at the tables, who were now watching the hostile corporate takeover in stunned silence. The security guards did not touch him, but they shadowed him closely, ensuring he didn't access any back-office terminals on his way out. Dennis pushed through the doors and stepped out onto the cleared sidewalk. He had no job, no severance, and a permanent black mark on his professional record. He buttoned his coat against the freezing wind and walked away, completely erased from the system he had worshipped. Inside the café, Linda turned to Allison. Lock the doors, close the store for the remainder of the day, pay the floor staff for their full scheduled shifts, plus a disruption bonus. I want a complete audit of this location's management culture by Monday morning. Understood, Allison said, immediately typing the operational override into her tablet. And our next objective? Pull the HR file for Greg Turner, Linda commanded. Find his residential address. We are leaving immediately. 3 miles away, in the deep, decaying suburbs of the city, Greg Turner woke up. His cramped, windowless studio apartment was freezing. The building's radiator was barely functioning, emitting a weak hiss of steam that did nothing to combat the residual chill of the blizzard. Greg sat up on his thin mattress. Every muscle in his body screamed in agonizing protest. His chest ached with a deep, rattling cough, a direct physiological consequence of walking 3 miles through a -20-degree wind chill in a wet cotton shirt. He reached for his phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, displaying the time 11:30 a.m. Beneath the clock was a single automated email notification from the Collins Hospitality Human Resources automated server. Subject: Notice of termination. Your employment profile, ID 4279, has been deactivated. Final payout will be processed within standard municipal labor timelines, minus uniform deduction fees. Greg stared at the glowing screen. The absolute terrifying reality of his situation settled over him like a suffocating weight. He opened his banking application. The balance was exactly $4.12. He had given his last $38 to the freezing woman in the subway terminal. He didn't regret it. He knew she would have died without it. But the moral victory did not change the brutal mathematics of his survival. His rent was due in exactly 11 days. He had no winter coat to go out and look for a new job. He was completely, mathematically ruined. Greg slowly dragged himself out of bed. He wrapped himself in a cheap fleece blanket and booted up his battered laptop. He couldn't afford to panic. Panic was a luxury. He immediately navigated to an online job board, typing warehouse and immediate hire into the search bar. He needed a job that didn't require a background check, something that paid under the table so he could make rent by the first of the month. He had just clicked on an application for a night shift loading dock position when a heavy authoritative knock echoed through his thin wooden door. Greg froze. He looked at the door. His landlord, a notoriously aggressive man who managed the decaying complex, was known to demand rent early if he suspected a tenant was struggling. Greg took a slow, painful breath, pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, and walked to the door. He didn't check the peephole. It didn't matter who it was. He had nothing left to lose. Greg unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Standing in the dimly lit, water-damaged hallway of the apartment complex were two massive men in dark wool overcoats. Standing perfectly between them was Allison Cooper, holding her locked digital tablet and a physical manila folder. Greg stared at them, completely bewildered. He recognized the silver Collins hospitality badges instantly. His tired brain tried to process why corporate security had tracked him down to a slum in the suburbs. "Greg Turner?" Allison asked. Her voice was sharp, professional, and entirely out of place in the decaying hallway. "Yes," Greg rasped, his voice still hoarse from the cold. "I already got the termination email. I don't have the uniform. It's at the store." Allison did not look at him with malice. She simply stepped aside, clearing the doorway. "We are not here for the uniform, Mr. Turner," Allison said. From the shadows of the hallway, Linda Collins stepped forward. She wore the immaculate charcoal blazer, looking like the apex of corporate power. But as Greg looked at her face, his eyes widened in absolute shock. He recognized the eyes. He recognized the face. It was the woman from the subway terminal. "Hello, Greg," Linda said quietly. "May we come in?" Greg Turner stared at the woman standing in the doorway of his decaying apartment. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. 12 hours ago, he had dragged this exact woman through knee-deep snow, her body limp from late-stage hypothermia. Now, she stood before him, radiating absolute authority, flanked by corporate security and the head of internal legal. "You," Greg whispered, his voice cracking. "You were dying." "I was in severe distress, yes," Linda Collins replied evenly. "May we come in?" Greg stepped back silently, pulling his cheap fleece blanket tighter. The apartment was barely larger than a walk-in closet. There were no chairs, only a thin mattress on the floor, a battered desk, and a single window with a cracked pane taped shut. The air inside was barely 45 degrees. Linda stepped into the room. She executed a rapid clinical inventory of the environment. She noted the water damage, the taped window, and the laptop displaying an application for overnight warehouse labor. The data points confirmed his entire financial reality. "My name is Linda Collins," she stated. I am the chief executive officer of Collins Hospitality. The cafe you worked at last night is one of 300 locations I own. Greg leaned heavily against the wall. Exhaustion overshadowed his shock. You're the owner. Dennis didn't know. If he knew, he would have treated me with deference, Linda interrupted coldly. That is precisely the problem. A manager who only exhibits human decency when it benefits his career is a liability. Last night was a stress test of my operational protocols. Dennis failed catastrophically. He has been terminated for cause, his administrative access liquidated, and he is permanently blacklisted. Greg blinked. He fired me. He logged an insubordination code. I am aware, Linda said. She gestured to Allison Cooper, who stepped forward with a physical folder. Allison is the head of corporate legal. She has expunged the code from your HR profile. The termination is officially voided. Furthermore, she calculated the legal liability this company would have faced if I, or any citizen, had frozen to death on our sidewalk due to Dennis's strict adherence to Section 4 of the manual. The wrongful death litigation and brand degradation would have cost the subsidiary an estimated $40 million. Linda took a step closer to Greg. When you intervened, you executed a perfect risk assessment. You recognized a fatal variable. You understood the directive issued by your manager, calculated the personal financial cost of defying it, and proceeded anyway. You sacrificed your employment, your winter gear, and your remaining capital to neutralize a critical threat. She held out an envelope. This is the $38 you gave me in the transit hub. It was an unauthorized loan to the corporation. It is being repaid. Greg slowly took the envelope. It contained the exact same crumpled bills. Ms. Collins, Greg said, his voice a hoarse rasp. I appreciate the reinstatement, but I can't go back to wiping espresso wands for $14 an hour, hoping I don't get penalized for a drop of milk. I can't survive on that math. You are not going back to the espresso machine, Linda stated flatly. You are fundamentally overqualified for a baseline operational role. She turned to Allison, who handed her a document printed on heavy, watermarked corporate stock. Collins Hospitality does not operate on charity, Greg. It operates on efficiency and asset management, Linda continued. Standardizing rules is easy. Standardizing judgment under extreme crisis is impossible. I can buy 1,000 managers like Dennis, who will blindly enforce a spreadsheet. I cannot buy someone who possesses the critical reasoning to burn the spreadsheet when a human life is on the line. She placed the heavy document on the battered desk. That is a managerial contract, Linda said. I am liquidating the current leadership structure of the 4th Street location. As of this morning, you are the director of operations for that flagship property. Your starting salary is $85,000 annually, with full corporate benefits and tuition reimbursement for your university studies. Your mandate is to rebuild the culture of that location. Greg Turner did not immediately reach for the heavy watermarked paper on his desk. The physical exhaustion and the residual effects of the cold made his brain sluggish, but the analytical survival instinct that had governed his entire adult life was rapidly processing the new variables. $85,000. Full corporate benefits, tuition reimbursement. For a young man who had spent the last 3 years calculating his existence in $14 increments, the number was almost abstract. It completely shattered the mathematical equation of his poverty. It meant he would never again have to choose between a gallon of milk and a subway fare. It meant the crumbling 45-degree apartment was no longer his permanent reality. Greg leaned over the battered desk. His hands were still trembling slightly, not from emotion, but from the lingering physiological stress of the blizzard. He picked up the contract. It was a standard corporate employment agreement, but Section 4, the section that detailed executive authority, had been heavily modified. This grants me unilateral hiring and firing authority for the entire 4th Street location, Greg stated, his voice a hoarse, mechanical rasp. He looked up at Linda Collins. It bypasses the regional district manager entirely. I would report directly to internal corporate auditing. Correct, Linda replied smoothly. The regional manager failed to detect Dennis Clark's sociopathic adherence to the manual. Therefore, the regional manager's oversight is permanently suspended for your location. You report to Allison. You have absolute operational control of the floor, the inventory, and the personnel. Greg set the contract back down. He didn't smile. He approached the situation with the exact same procedural logic he used behind the espresso machine. Dennis was obsessed with metrics because the corporate structure rewarded him for it, Greg said, identifying the systemic flaw. If I take over the location, the queue efficiency will drop. The transaction times will increase. I will not penalize the staff for minor sanitation infractions when the store is empty, which means the localized disciplinary logs will look entirely different than the historical data. Will I be penalized for degrading the brand's statistical perfection? A faint flicker of genuine respect crossed Linda's face. In the immediate aftermath of a life-altering financial windfall, Greg was not focused on the money. He was auditing the operational risks of his new position. You will not be evaluated on micrometrics, Greg, Linda assured him, her tone completely professional. Your key performance indicator is no longer the speed of an espresso pull. Your metric is the stabilization of a human-centric hospitality environment. You will maintain profitability, but you will do so without turning the staff into automated drones. If a barista spills milk, they clean it up. They do not lose their shift pay. Greg nodded slowly. The logic was sound. He picked up a cheap plastic pen from his desk. He didn't ask for time to think it over. He didn't ask to consult a lawyer. He understood leverage, and he knew that this contract was the absolute apex of his professional trajectory. He signed his name on the bottom line. Allison Cooper stepped forward. She took the signed document, placed it into the physical manila folder, and handed Greg a sealed black envelope. Inside is a corporate smartphone, fully synced to the Collins Hospitality mainframe. Allison instructed, reverting to her strict legal cadence. Your administrative overrides are already active. There is also a corporate credit card. It is strictly for business expenses, but Ms. Collins has authorized an immediate discretionary draw. For what? Greg asked, looking at the envelope. For a winter coat, Linda answered flatly. You surrendered your personal survival gear to protect a corporate asset. The company is replacing it. Purchase a suitable jacket, procure reliable transportation, and take the next 48 hours to recover from the physical trauma of the weather event. You assume command of the café on Monday morning at 5 a.m. Linda turned toward the door, her charcoal blazer immaculate, her posture rigid. She paused with her hand on the doorknob and looked back at the young man shivering in the freezing, decaying apartment. Collins Hospitality does not forget its debts, Mr. Turner, Linda said quietly. You saved my life. Now, fix my store. The CEO, the head of legal, and the two massive security contractors exited the apartment, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind them. Greg was left standing alone in the freezing silence. He looked at the $38 in cash on the desk. Then he looked at the black corporate envelope. The brutal, terrifying mathematics of his life had been entirely rewritten. He opened the envelope, pulled out the sleek smartphone, and immediately ordered a cab. At 4:45 a.m. on Monday, the digital thermometer outside the Roasters Guild read a manageable 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The city's municipal power grid was fully operational. The streets were heavily salted by the local Department of Transportation crews, and the morning commute was slowly resuming its standard logistical rhythm. The blizzard was officially a closed meteorological chapter. Inside the café, the automated environmental systems woke up with mechanical precision. The ambient lighting slowly faded up to exactly 2,700 Kelvin. The central thermostat locked the climate control at 72 degrees. The commercial espresso boilers pressurized at 200 degrees. The physical environment was exactly as it had always been, but the operational hierarchy governing the space had been completely liquidated. Greg Turner walked through the heavy glass doors. He was no longer wearing the thin, faded cotton uniform of a junior barista, nor was he wearing the taped-together canvas shoes. He wore a heavy, insulated winter coat, procured via the corporate discretionary draw, and a clean, functional button-down shirt. His physical recovery was complete, his core temperature was stable, and the deep respiratory fatigue from the sub-zero exposure had cleared. 2 junior baristas, Sarah and Mark, were already stationed behind the quartz counter. They were nervously organizing the pastry case according to the old, rigid schematics. They had spent the entire weekend in a state of high operational anxiety. The sudden, unexplained termination of Dennis Clark and the hostile corporate takeover, led by the chief executive officer, had sent shockwaves through the district's internal communication servers. They expected a new, ruthless corporate enforcer to arrive and tighten the regulations even further. They did not expect Greg. Greg walked to the back office, hung up his coat, and approached the primary point-of-sale terminal. He didn't use his old 4-digit employee PIN. He entered the 9-digit alphanumeric administrative override code Allison Cooper had activated. The screen flashed green, immediately recognizing him as the director of operations. He spent 6 minutes navigating the localized HR dashboard. He systematically and permanently disabled the automated wage deduction macros linked to minor sanitation infractions. He then opened the emergency protocols folder and rewrote the localized mandate for severe weather events, officially logging the changes with corporate legal. He walked back out to the floor. Sarah and Mark stood rigidly at attention, their hands tightly gripping microfiber cloths, bracing for a uniform inspection. "Good morning," Greg said. His voice was calm, carrying the grounded weight of actual administrative authority rather than bureaucratic intimidation. "Morning, Greg," Mark said hesitantly. "Or, Mr. Turner, the master schedule updated at midnight. It says you're the store director." "Greg is fine," he replied, conducting a rapid visual sweep of the espresso station. He didn't pull out a digital stopwatch. He didn't consult the thick black operational manual. "Listen closely. The corporate structure of this location has fundamentally changed. Our primary directive is no longer the strict enforcement of micrometrics. Our directive is sustainable hospitality and hazard prevention." The baristas exchanged a confused look. They had been conditioned for months to fear the manual above all else. "If you spill a drop of milk, wipe it up with the designated chemical spray," Greg continued, delivering the new operational reality in a dry, procedural cadence. "You will not be docked 15 minutes of shift pay for a minor sanitation correction. If the queue backs up because a burr grinder needs recalibrating, let it back up. You are authorized to prioritize mechanical maintenance and product safety over statistical speed. We are running a commercial business, not a forced labor camp." He walked around the counter and pointed toward the heavy glass doors. "Most importantly," Greg stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation, "if a severe weather event occurs, or if a human being enters this building in visible medical distress, Section 4 of the manual is immediately suspended. You will offer shelter. You will offer water. You will use the discretionary managerial comp tab to provide a hot beverage to stabilize their core temperature. If you are unsure of the legal liability, you bypass the shift supervisor and come directly to me. We will never again weaponize this brand against human survival. Are we clear?" "Understood," both baristas replied simultaneously. The visible tension drained from their shoulders. The crushing, sociopathic anxiety that had defined their shifts under Dennis Clark evaporated into the warm air. Greg looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 4:59 a.m. He reached for the master keyring in his pocket, walked to the front of the store, disabled the commercial deadbolt, and pushed the heavy glass doors open to the brisk morning air. The first customer of the day, a wealthy corporate patron in a tailored suit, was waiting on the sidewalk. He stepped inside, expecting the usual sterile, robotic transaction. Greg stepped behind the massive chrome espresso machine. He didn't need a spreadsheet to manage the floor. He knew the machinery, he knew the inventory, and he knew exactly how much human endurance it took to survive the shift. He picked up a ceramic mug, completely at ease in his new reality. "Good morning," Greg said, the ambient jazz playing softly in the background. "What can we get started for you today?" The mechanical heart of Colin's hospitality was still beating, perfectly calibrated and highly profitable. But for the first time in the history of the 4th Street location, it was being run by a human being who understood the actual cost of survival. Thank you for watching today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts on Greg's decision in the comments below. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next video.